I have to say too that there were moments that were just so. And I want to circle back to this, but sometimes it's really just shocking to hear a prisoner talk about an experience, and then a former, not necessarily. I mean, some of the guards, they don't like to be called guards, but a former commissioner just basically be like, yeah, no, that's what we wanted to do. I mean, something to that effect, like where the brutality just seemed to be shocking. But Reuven, tell us. Will you give us just some broad statistics for people about Rikers? I'm not sure that necessarily nationally everyone is aware of just what kind of place this is.
Yeah, absolutely. So just the geography itself, it's on the East River. There's one sort of public bus that takes you there, and there's one bridge that gets you there as well. Like the bus goes over this bridge, and it's away from the courthouses in New York City. So that geography is one of the big issues that of the driving forces behind the kind of close Rikers plan as well. Currently, there's about 6,000 people locked up there. The overwhelming majority is pretrial detainees. I think it's over 80%. And of that 80%, 50% of the population has diagnosed with some type of mental illness, including 16% with a serious mental illness.
Pretrial detainees, can you expand on that? Because I'm not sure, again, people nationally are aware of the fact that there are a lot of people housed in Rikers who have not been convicted of anything. And in fact, there are people who have died in Rikers prior to any kind of conviction or trial.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, pretrial essentially is that, they're held up there while their cases are pending, and because they can't make bail. And there's a kind of a big conversation now in New York City about bail reform that was changed a couple of years ago. And many of the people there are there because some, not necessarily as much as it used to be with small amounts of bail, but there are definitely people there who have issues with court appearances. And yeah, I mean, just overwhelming number of people have not been convicted of a crime, and the people who do stay there, the maximum stay is supposed to be a year. Now that actually is the state has gone up way up recently because a lot of these cases are the trials or the court hearings are kind of getting dragged out for kind of a multitude of reasons. But ultimately, yeah, it's people who overwhelmingly who have not been convicted. And you referenced the deaths. Last year there was 19, right, Graham? I think it was 19, which is the highest rate in the last, I think, 2 or 3 decades of people who passed away. And the overwhelming number of those had never been convicted of a crime. Never in that moment, I mean.
And I want to circle back on that number of deaths too, because the number of people at Rikers now seems to be at more or less an all-time low. Their budget seems to be at an all-time high, and yet, I mean, presumably, having deaths at the prison is a one sign of a massive failure. But Graham, just to flesh this out a little bit more, when we say that people are there awaiting trial, like, what are the numbers there? I mean, you're only supposed to be there for a year, which seems to be a long time awaiting trial. But like, what is the average stay? Like, if I'm awaiting trial and I don't have the money for bail, how many times do I go back? And you talk about this, actually, I guess it's called the bullpen theory or bullpen therapy. Will you tell us what the bullpen therapy is and sort of like give us the numbers of just how many people are there for how long? Because once we start talking about the conditions there, I mean, it is really just, it's like medieval on some level.
Sure. The average stay, the average pretrial stay, these days, the last number we saw it's over 100 days. So someone gets arrested, they're staying there for an extraordinarily long time, and there are people there who are there for a year pretrial, 2 years pretrial, 3 years, 4 years. There's one guy who's been there for 8 years awaiting trial, and
how can that be legal? I mean, how can that be constitutional that somebody's in jail for 8 years without having been convicted of a crime?
It's extraordinary. There's a young man in the book. He went in at 19 and his case finally got resolved he was 24. That was all pre-trial detention. When he finally got sentenced, he was sentenced to 3 weeks in state prison. So he did 5 years pre-trial to get 3 weeks in state prison. There's a lot of reasons. The case of the man who's in there for 8 years, there's a lot of complicated reasons. But for people who've been there for 3 years, it's just the general bureaucratic situation in New York City. The pandemic, the slowdown, and the backlog that was created by the pandemic contributed to that. But even in regular times, you have people going for court appearances 8, 10, 9, 10, 11, 12 times over the course of a year and a half, 2 years, and nothing happens in their case. And those court appearances, what you're referring to as bullpen therapy, where you're going back and forth from the island to the courthouse and back with nothing happening in your case, it can become so debilitating that people plead guilty just to get out of the situation. And that gives prosecutors, whether intentional or not, it gives them leverage. If you're being held in jail, you're more likely to want to get your case resolved however you can, rather than if you're out on bail, when people are more likely to fight their cases if they're out on bail.
And particularly this jail. I mean, this is. But Reuven, what is your sense as to how much of a strategy this is by prosecutors? And maybe not in each individual case, but in the aggregate, one of the mechanisms that we use, I'm just hypothesizing, one of the mechanisms we use as a prosecutor to try less cases and to get more guilty pleas is just to keep making them go back and forth between Rikers. So people know Rikers is an island, and it is an all-day affair. We hear stories in the book that you miss dinner, but it's not, dinner doesn't sound like something that you necessarily want, but it's an exhausting affair. And to leave and then go back into Rikers sounds like literally like entering into a nightmare each time. I mean, it must be, as we talk more about it, we'll hear, but how much of this do you think is a general overall strategy in which to deal with cases?
We interview people and, former detainees and one of the things we asked them was like, what was the worst part of the experience? Or like, and for me, the answer I thought would be the violence or a multiple of other, a ton of other possibilities. But I interviewed somebody, his name is Paul Wooster for the book. And he said, the worst part was this bullpen therapy, the cycle of back and forth, and just how exhausting and draining it is. And it just seems so baked into the system, like into the New York City kind of criminal justice system that exists, that it's just like they just kind of almost kind of force people to plead their cases out because they just don't want to go back and forth. And part of the challenge is also when you go back and forth is you're putting these bullpens with different people. Some people, if you're like warring gangs, are sometimes put into the system, and there's a lot of violence that just kind of happens in these bullpens themselves. And frequently, I talked to Michael Jacobson, who's a former commissioner, corrections department commissioner, and he told me that they would struggle in the 90s when the population was about 20,000, and now it's about closer to 6,000. But he said that they literally would miss the court, like they couldn't get them there by 9 a.m. So they'd wake them up at 3, 4 in the morning. By the time they got them out on the vans, they would miss the date. They would miss the actual hearing itself at 9 a.m. So it's just one of these things that he said was struggling with when he was there in the 90s. And we interviewed multiple commissioners, and every single one of them has said, this has been an issue that we have battled forever.
So now, why is that 6 hour lag? It's because this is not just like, hey, hop in an Uber, head down to the court. They're in chains. They have to go through a process in which they sort of like outtake and intake and get into the van. I mean, what are the different, what makes it, why is it so long to do that transfer?
I mean, also like just for the national audience, but like New York City's busy, it's a busy place and there's traffic, like going into Manhattan, going into the Bronx, going to the Queens, like, anyone who's driven in any of these places during rush hour, will tell you, you end up sitting for a while. So there's that part of it, but it's also just the kind of the bureaucracy, that just the slow, the paperwork, the getting the people in the right vans at the right place, the right time. It's just the sheer number of doing it, getting the people, for the right dates. It's just, there's constant mess ups.